Princess Catherine just did something the palace almost never allows. And the reason behind it is far more emotional than anyone inside those walls expected. She sat down alone, looked at the carefully prepared script her advisors had placed in front of her, and pushed it aside completely. She completely refused to read whatever they wanted her to say about her son. She spoke in her own words about Prince Louis and the private recovery journey the family had been hiding for months. And here is where it gets deeply personal. The palace had stayed silent for so long that people began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were engagements being quietly rearranged? Why was the youngest prince simply nowhere to be seen? That silence was William's decision from the beginning. He believed protecting Louis was the only way to shield him from the kind of permanent scrutiny that follows royal children for life. Catherine understood that completely, but somewhere along the way, she came to a painful realization. The silence had stopped protecting Louis. It had started convincing him that his own family was ashamed of him, and that is the detail that changes everything. So, let's talk about how this all started, because honestly, it goes back much further than the moment Louis got sick. Long before that, William had already made up his mind about how illness in his family would be handled. He had decided that whatever happened, it would stay inside the family and away from public view completely. To understand why he felt so strongly about that, you need to go back even further than that decision, all the way back to when William was a boy himself, watching his own mother get chased by cameras until the day she died. That memory never left William. It shaped the way he sees every single camera, every single reporter, and every single question about his family's private life. So when Louis first started showing signs of a respiratory illness, William didn't see a sick child who needed rest and doctors. He saw a story waiting to be stolen, the same way he felt his mother's story was stolen from her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left that was hers alone. So, William gave one order. Nothing about Louis's condition leaves this household. No statements, no explanations, nothing. And for a while, that order held. Louis quietly disappeared from the royal calendar, and aides were told to deflect any questions and change the subject fast. And they got good at it too, redirecting reporters toward Princess Charlotte's latest school event, or George's upcoming appearance, anything that kept the conversation away from Louis. And for a while, it worked, at least on the surface. But here's the thing about secrets inside a royal household. They are never as sealed as the people at the top like to believe. There are simply too many people involved, too many hands that touch the schedule, and too many eyes that see the comings and goings of doctors who aren't supposed to be noticed. And this is where it gets interesting, because while William was busy locking down the story from the outside, a crack was already forming from the inside, and nobody saw it coming. One of the junior aides handling Louis's schedule had a problem of their own, something personal and completely unrelated to the Wales family, involving serious debt and pressure from people this aide could not afford to say no to. This wasn't someone who set out to betray the family. This was someone who got backed into a corner long before Louis ever got sick. And once that corner closes in on you, the options start looking a lot thinner than they should. This particular aide had worked inside the household for years, trusted enough to handle private schedules and quiet arrangements, which is exactly why nobody thought to watch them closely. Because this is the kind of relationship that starts small and only grows more dangerous the longer it goes unnoticed. It rarely announces itself, and usually starts with something that feels harmless, a passing comment confirmed, or a date checked. Nothing that feels like betrayal in the moment. But the door was open, even if it was just a crack, and that's honestly the scariest part of secrets like this. They don't fail all at once. They fail quietly, through someone nobody was watching, someone who probably never wanted any of this in the first place. What makes this even harder to sit with is that this aide genuinely cared about the family. That's what made the position so dangerous in the first place. Somebody who wanted to protect the household could still end up being the exact reason it was exposed, simply because fear works differently than loyalty does. Fear makes people quiet when they should speak up, and it makes them agree to things they would never agree to under normal circumstances. Nobody around this aide noticed anything wrong, because on the surface, nothing had changed. The work still got done. The schedule still ran on time. That's usually how these things stay hidden for so long, because the damage doesn't show up in performance. It shows up later, all at once, when it's already too late to stop it quietly. Meanwhile, inside the household, something else was happening, something far more human than politics or leaks. Nobody had explained anything to George or Charlotte. Nobody sat them down and told them what was actually going on with their little brother. But children pick up more than adults think, and these two were no exception. The tension in a house has its own language, spoken in slammed doors that used to be left open, in hushed phone calls that stopped the second a child walked into the room, in a mother who smiled a little too carefully at breakfast. Both kids were starting to learn that language fast, even without a single word being said to them directly. And that kind of learning leaves a mark that doesn't just disappear once the crisis is over. Meals grew quieter. Laughter, when it came at all, felt shorter than it used to. So by the end of this stretch, you had a palace convinced its silence was airtight, a family slowly cracking under the weight of what wasn't being said, and one small, dangerous leak waiting to happen just beneath the surface. And yet, underneath all of that tension, there was one piece of good news finally starting to take hold. Lewis's health was slowly improving, and it was that improvement, more than anything else, that pushed William and Catherine to finally test the waters. So they arranged a private rehearsal at Windsor, with no cameras and no crowds, just close family and a few trusted staff. This was a gentle trial run to see whether Lewis was ready to step back into royal life at all. Everyone involved had agreed it would be low pressure, a handful of trusted staff and nothing more. Exactly the kind of soft re-entry William had been fighting for since Louis first got sick. Nobody expected it to become the most terrifying morning of Catherine and William's lives. Midway through, Louis stopped walking. He reached for his mother's hand and told her he couldn't catch his breath. And just like that, every careful plan the family had built collapsed in seconds. Because no amount of preparation can prepare a parent for the moment their child says those exact words. Catherine dropped to her knees immediately. William cleared the room, keeping only the medical team. And then he did something nobody expected, not even Catherine. Instead of asking a nanny or an aide to take George and Charlotte somewhere safe, William did it himself. He walked both children out by hand, speaking to them in a low, steady voice that gave nothing away, even though his own heart was pounding. That single choice tells you everything about what was going through his head at that moment. Because somewhere in William's memory is a boy who was shielded from his own mother's pain and told nothing, ushered out of rooms without explanation, left to guess and imagine the worst on his own. And here William was, without even realizing it, repeating that exact same pattern with his own children. Except this time, he told himself it was protection instead of exclusion. Because that's what it always looks like from the inside. William would later admit he barely remembers walking them down that corridor at all, as if some older, practiced part of him had simply taken over. What the world will never hear officially is just how close that morning came to going a completely different way. Because once the immediate danger passed, a doctor pulled William aside, away from Catherine, and told him plainly that if they had waited even one more hour to act, this story could be ending very differently right now. This was not a warning meant to frighten him further. It was just the truth, delivered quietly and directly, the way doctors learn to deliver the hardest sentences of their careers. William carried that sentence alone for weeks. He never repeated it to Catherine in full, not because he wanted to hide it from her, but because he could not bring himself to hand her a fear that heavy while she was already drowning in her own. It felt like love in the moment, a husband trying to carry the worst of it so his wife wouldn't have to. But it would later become one more brick in a wall of silence that was slowly building between them, a wall neither of them meant to build, but both of them kept adding to anyway, one unspoken fear at a time. And there's one more thing William admitted much later, something that shows just how frightened he really was underneath that composed, decisive exterior everyone saw that day. Standing outside the room where his son was being treated, William found himself praying, and it had been years since his mother's funeral, since he had done that. Just think about that for a second. A future king, trained his entire life to stay composed under pressure, was reduced to praying in a hallway because he had absolutely no control over what happened next. No title, no protocol, and no amount of authority could fix what was happening behind that door. That was the moment that should have taught this family that silence has limits, that some fears are too big to carry alone no matter how strong you're supposed to be. Instead, it taught them the opposite, and that mistake is exactly what pushed George and Charlotte into a corner nobody was watching closely enough. If the last chapter belonged to the parents, then this one belongs to George and Charlotte. And honestly, it might be the part of this story that hits hardest. George, being the oldest, quietly decided that staying calm was his job now. Nobody assigned him that role. He just took it, the way the oldest children so often do, stepping into a kind of quiet responsibility that nobody asked for and nobody thanked him for either. But it was eating George alive in private. At night, when nobody was watching, he would always pull out a tablet and search for his brother's symptoms himself, trying to understand what the adults around him refused to explain, and trying to prepare himself for something he didn't even have the words for. George kept a small mental list of questions he never asked out loud, afraid that saying them might somehow make things worse. One night, he asked his father directly whether a younger brother could get seriously sick without anyone outside the family ever finding out. It sounded like an innocent question, but it wasn't. George was actually asking whether the quiet in the house was something to be scared of, and William didn't have a good answer for him, because honestly, he didn't have a good answer for himself either. Charlotte's experience took a different shape, but it cut just as deep. She has always noticed more than adults give her credit for, and this time was no exception. Catherine caught a fragment of a hallway conversation between staff members, just 2 words really, worst case, spoken low and quick between 2 people who thought no child was listening. And those 2 words lodged themselves in her mind and refused to leave, replaying over and over whenever the house went quiet. So she started leaving handwritten jokes beside Louis's bed, not because anyone told her to, but because she had figured out on her own that laughter, even for a few seconds, brought back the brother she recognized, the one who used to chase her through the halls before all of this started. Some nights Louis was too tired to even read them, but Charlotte would leave them there anyway, propped against the lamp for the next morning. And then, in a detail neither parent knew about at first, she started quietly sleeping outside Louis's door some nights, curled up against the frame because she couldn't stand being anywhere else, needing to know she was close if anything happened. It was George, not either parent, who found Charlotte there first. And in that hallway, the 2 of them shared something the adults hadn't fully noticed yet, a silent understanding that they were in this together, even if nobody had told them what this actually was or how long it might last. After that night, something quietly shifted between the 2 siblings. George started checking on Charlotte the same way he had been checking on Louis, without making a show of it. Charlotte, in turn, stopped asking George the harder questions, sensing somehow that he was carrying enough already. Neither of them ever said this out loud to each other. Children rarely explain why they start doing the things they do to hold a family together. They just do them quietly, like the way George kept his late-night searches secret, and Charlotte kept her nights outside Louis's door a secret too, with each one trying to protect the other from a fear neither of them had the words to name yet. Eventually, Charlotte couldn't hold it in anymore. She found Catherine and asked her directly whether strangers outside the palace were now worried about her brother too, because she had picked up enough to know the outside world was starting to wonder where Louis had gone, because he wasn't appearing anywhere anymore. And then Charlotte asked the question that should stop anyone in their tracks. Would Louis have to answer all of them himself one day? That was the moment Catherine finally understood, fully and completely, that the silence built to protect one child had quietly reshaped all 3 of them and turned her house into a place where children whispered instead of asked questions. That realization was exactly what pushed her to do something the palace has almost never allowed. Unable to reconcile the polished palace draft with everything her family had actually lived through, Catherine sat down after the children had gone to bed one night and wrote her own statement by hand. She worked through several drafts before she found words that actually matched what her family had survived. She then placed her version right next to the official one, and the contrast between the 2 said everything before either of them spoke a word. One was careful and distant. The other was raw and true. William read the opening line of Catherine's version and immediately shook his head. He bluntly told her that one public statement could be replayed and picked apart for years after their son had fully recovered. He said words spoken once in a moment of emotion have a way of following a person forever. But underneath William's anger was that same old fear of losing control of his family's story, the way it was taken from his mother decades ago, piece by piece, until there was nothing private left at all. He reminded Catherine, almost desperately, that the press had never once given his own family the benefit of the doubt, and he saw no reason they would start now. Then, right in the middle of that argument, William's phone rang, and he was informed that the tabloid connected to the earlier leak was not waiting for the palace to make a decision. They were going ahead with their own story regardless, and time had officially run out. William was shown a mock-up of the headline they had already prepared. It painted the family's silence as neglect, as if Louis vanishing from public life meant he had been abandoned rather than protected. That headline was built to sell papers by making a frightened family look like a careless one. And that, more than anything Catherine had said up to that point, is what finally broke William's resistance. Just think about the cruelty of that for a second. The very silence he built to protect his son was about to hand that same story to someone who would tell it far more brutally than his wife ever would. Like that wasn't enough heartbreak already, Catherine told William what Louis himself had actually asked for. He wanted George and Charlotte to know their quiet support meant something, that their jokes and their late nights outside his door had not gone unnoticed. And more than anything, Louis did not want people thinking he had disappeared because he was not brave enough to face them. William sat down and covered his face. He then admitted something he had never said out loud before, that his decisions had been driven just as much by his own fear of losing control as by any real instinct to protect his son. That admission cost him something to say. But there was still one more approval standing in the way, and that belonged to King Charles. When the draft reached him, he read it twice. When he got to the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, something in him shifted, because Charles carries his own quiet regret too. He has spent years thinking about how much was hidden from his own generation during the Diana years, how silence back then was mistaken for protection, and how that silence did not end well for anyone. It was a lesson he had hoped never to relive with his own grandchildren. So he rejected the sanitized version completely and plainly told William that a statement with Louis's own words stripped out would protect the institution while failing the boy at the center of it. Charles's condition was simple and non-negotiable. Louis had to hear every single word first and understand exactly what the world was about to learn about him. When Catherine read it to Louis in private, he listened with a seriousness that felt too grown up for a boy his age, following every sentence closely. Then he stopped her at one line. He did not want the world to think he was merely doing better. He wanted them to know he was getting strong again. It was a small distinction, but it mattered more to him than anyone realized. Catherine changed the sentence right there on the spot. Charles approved the final version with a handwritten note that would echo through everything that happened next. He wrote that truth delivered with restraint protects the crown more honestly than silence ever could. The statement was approved. But approval on paper is not the same as saying the words out loud in front of a camera, knowing there would be no second take. At the appointed hour, Catherine sat down with the palace's official script placed in front of her. It was the same careful, distant version William had objected to weeks earlier. She read through it one final time. Then, in front of the camera, she turned it face down on the table beside her. For a moment, Catherine said nothing at all, and the pause stretched just long enough that anyone watching could tell something had shifted. Then she began speaking in her own words instead, exactly as she and William had agreed she would. Catherine started with the truth the palace draft had never once mentioned by name. Louis had been fighting a serious respiratory illness, the kind that had made ordinary breathing a struggle on his worst days, and it had taken him months to climb out of it. Catherine did not soften this. She described how the illness had stripped away things nobody ever thinks to be grateful for until they are gone. Running the length of a hallway, laughing hard enough to lose your breath on purpose, the way children do, without a second thought. For Louis, both of those simple things had become exhausting, and for a long stretch of time, both of them had become impossible. Catherine described the mornings her son woke up wanting to run and play just like George and Charlotte, only to find his body simply would not let him keep up, no matter how badly he wanted it to. She said Louis never complained about this out loud. Instead, he found his own quiet way of sitting the disappointment out, like stepping back from a game before anyone noticed he was struggling, or telling his brother and sister he was tired rather than admitting he was frightened. Catherine's voice slowed here, and she paused before continuing, as though she were choosing each next sentence carefully rather than reciting it. Her son had learned to measure his own energy the way an adult manages a limited resource, deciding early in a day which moments mattered most, because there was rarely enough strength left for all of them. No child his age should have to think that way about his own body, and no parent should have to watch it happen without being able to fix it. Then Catherine moved into what recovery had actually looked like inside their home, away from every camera and every scheduled appearance. She described the first time Louis raced Charlotte down a corridor and actually finished instead of stopping halfway through, and how the whole family had celebrated that small, ordinary moment as though he had won something enormous, because in every way that mattered, he had. Catherine described the first night Louis asked to stay up a little later, not because he was pretending to feel fine for everyone else's sake, but because he genuinely had the energy to spare, and how she had cried quietly in the hallway afterward once his door was closed, relieved in a way she said she still could not fully put into words. Recovery had never been one dramatic turn for the better. It had been a long, slow collection of small victories that nobody outside their walls would ever have recognized as victories at all. It was right there, on that line, that Catherine's composure finally slipped. Her voice caught in her throat. She stopped for a second, blinking hard, and a single tear slid down her cheek before she managed to continue. She thanked the doctors and nurses by name, every one of them, refusing to let their care disappear into a vague, generic line of gratitude. Catherine carefully spoke about George and Charlotte, describing what they had carried, without ever turning their private pain into a spectacle for the cameras. And when she reached the line Louis himself had asked her to include, she said it exactly the way he had wanted it said, her voice breaking slightly on the final few words. He did not consider himself brave for staying quiet all those months. He wanted the world to know that the people who kept trying to reach him anyway, even when he gave them almost nothing to hold on to, were the ones who deserved to be called brave. She held the camera's gaze as she said it, tears still visible, refusing to look away or cut the recording short. The statement took less than 3 minutes from start to finish, but it was the most any working royal had ever said about a child's illness in their own words, delivered with real tears rather than a rehearsed catch in the voice. And everyone watching knew exactly what they had just witnessed. What came after is where this story truly explodes, because not everyone in this family agreed with what Catherine had done, and some of them were about to make that very clear. Camilla found out the statement had gone out the exact same way the rest of the world did, through the broadcast, not through a private word from Charles beforehand. That alone stung more than she let on at first, and it sharpened into something far more pointed once Camilla finally spoke to Charles. And her warning wasn't really about Louis at all. It was about precedent. What does it mean when a working royal can override the institution's control over its own story? What happens the next time someone in this family decides the palace's careful wording isn't good enough? And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Camilla said, the one thing nobody else in this family had been willing to say out loud, that this sets the exact same argument Harry and Meghan made years ago back into motion, except this time, it's coming from inside the family instead of outside it. Camilla knew that comparison would wound Charles more than almost anything else she could say, because that particular rift has never fully healed, and she said it anyway. Princess Anne's reaction was colder still, and it happened in front of another family member, which is exactly why it landed as a real rupture instead of a quiet disagreement. Briefed by Charles earlier than Camilla had been, Anne confronted William directly and called the entire reveal an emotional indulgence dressed up as courage, a line that hung in the room longer than she probably intended. That's not cruelty for its own sake. Anne genuinely believes the monarchy has survived wars, scandal, and grief precisely because it never explains its private pain to the public, and that restraint has always been the institution's greatest strength. So she pointedly reminded William that the Diana years already proved exactly what happens once a royal family's private story becomes public property, and how quickly sympathy can curdle into something else entirely. Out of everything said to William throughout this entire ordeal, that line cut the deepest, because it came from someone who lived through the consequences the first time around and watched what it did to the people she loved. Outside the palace, the public response was immediate and honestly overwhelming. Families started leaving handwritten blue stars along the barrier outside Windsor, each one carrying Louis's own words, getting strong again, until the gates were covered in them. A wall of paper and ink from strangers who had never met this boy but felt something for him anyway. Some visitors stood quietly for a long moment before walking away, as if they had come to pay their respects to someone they had never met. A newspaper put Catherine's calm expression on its front page under the words, "A Mother's Voice." Not everyone was satisfied, though. Some commentators latched onto a single line from the recording, the moment we feared recovery had changed direction, and pushed hard for a second, more detailed statement, treating one sentence like a door that had to be pried all the way open. Catherine refused. She held firm that acknowledging the journey never meant surrendering every private detail, and after everything this family had just been through, that boundary became its own quiet act of strength. But the real turning point in this entire story didn't happen in public at all. It happened when William found Louis sitting alone in the family's private garden room after the announcement. No doctors, no protective aides, just father and son. William sat down on the floor instead of the chair beside him, bringing himself level with his boy, and asked him simply how he felt now that people knew. Lewis's answer changed something in his father completely. He said he had noticed William stop talking about royal events whenever he walked into the room, and that he had started believing everyone thought he would never be strong enough to be part of that world again, a fear he had been carrying quietly for weeks, without telling a single person. And then, Louis said the one thing that broke William open entirely. During the worst week, he had heard his father crying outside his bedroom door, and he pretended to be asleep because he didn't know how to comfort him, a moment neither of them had spoken about until right now. William pulled his son close and told him, finally, that bravery was never about not being afraid. It was about speaking even when fear made silence feel so much easier. That conversation changed more than just the relationship between father and son. William went to Catherine that same night and told her everything he had been carrying alone since the morning at Windsor, the doctor's warning, the fear that had kept him praying in a hallway, the weight he thought he was protecting her from by staying silent. Catherine listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him plainly that she had been carrying her own version of the same silence, afraid to burden him further while he was already so afraid himself. For the first time in months, neither of them was protecting the other from the truth. They were simply sharing it, together, the way they should have been doing from the very beginning. Louis chose his own way back into public life after that. Not a grand ceremony, just a small, unannounced family engagement tied to a children's community project, with George and Charlotte walking beside him the entire way, exactly where they had been since this whole ordeal began. No press briefing, no performance, just a boy stepping back into the world at his own pace, flanked by the only two people who had been sleeping outside his door and researching his illness in secret because they loved him too much to stay quiet about it. And behind the scenes, the palace quietly began revising its entire approach to family privacy going forward, aware that the old rules had nearly cost them something they could never get back. King Charles was left with a question he never said out loud to anyone. If this is what it took to save Louis, what happens the day George faces the exact same impossible choice with children of his own? Because if this story proved anything, it's that silence might protect a crown for a while, but eventually, it always costs somebody something.